but let's start with this. The news is not always a pleasure nowadays, but you wrote a couple pieces I wanted to talk about. The first was headlined "The Free Market, quote unquote, the fatal error of the foundational myth of center-left politics." Now, I would argue there's more than one foundational a fatal error in that foundational myth, perhaps. But you're reacting to a piece in the New York Times by Noam Scheiber uh, about a shift to stakeholder capitalism, which is the idea that executives try to serve, or rather, I'll let you shareholder capitalism from stakeholder to shareholder, but I'll let you summarize it.
Yeah, so Noam Schreiber, and I feel a little bad because I know him a bit. I think he's been the labor reporter at the Times for I don't know how long. He generally does very good work. But I really took issue with this because again, I'm calling this a myth, and I think it's very much a myth, that we used to have corporations that were focused stakeholder capitalism, that they recognized their commitment to their workers, the community. I don't think that's altogether wrong. But what I do think was wrong is that he sees this as this shift that now they're focused on just maximizing shareholder value. And the reason why I think that's fundamentally wrong is that CEOs rip off their companies. And it's not because I don't raise that because I'm so sympathetic to shareholders. It just happens to be the reality. And I'll say why I think it's important in a moment. But the first thing is that CEO pay does not actually bear a close relationship to returns to shareholders. I've done a little work on this. A lot of other people have done much more work. You find things like if you try to look at shareholder returns relative to CEO pay, there's very little relationship. It's basically CEOs. The story here is the CEO pay is largely determined by their board of directors, who in turn largely owe their jobs to the CEOs. So you have this circular relationship. You want to get on the board? Well, make friends with the top management, maybe not the CEO, maybe the chief financial officer, whatever. You get on the board, you stay on the board as long as you keep other board members happy. So board members are elected, of course, by shareholders. But again, it's not really a debatable point. The research when board members are nominated for re-election by shareholders, more than 99% of the time they win. So we joke about that. This is about the same as what you had in the Soviet Union. If you go back to the old Soviet Union, they had elections. No one ever lost. The Communist Party candidate always won. Well, it's pretty much the same for board members of the board of directors if they're nominated for re-election by their board. So from the standpoint of a board member, this is a good job. It tends to pay hundreds of thousands a year. It's very part-time, 200, maybe 300 hours of work. And you go home with a big paycheck for doing nothing, basically. So you want to stay on the board. How do you stay on the board? You keep your fellow board members happy. So you don't ask questions like, we're paying our CEO $30 million a year. They don't really seem to be that sharp. Maybe we can get someone as good for $15 million. There's no downward pressure on their pay. And this is kind of a straightforward proposition. We all understand that, if you're paying a retail clerk $50 an hour, everyone will go, well, can't you get a retail clerk for half that? There's competition. But for CEOs, for top management, there isn't. It doesn't work that way. And my reason for saying that that's important, and again, it's not that I'm so anxious to see more money go to the shareholders, but the point is this is not a free market, and it affects the wage distribution more generally. Because if the CEOs, I remember once I was arguing with a friend, he's going, "Wow, there's 500 CEOs of the corporate, the S&P 500." I go, "Yeah, I know that." But the point is it affects the wage distribution more generally. If the CEO is getting 30 million, odds are the chief financial officer is getting 10 to 15 million. You have a next echelon of management, they're probably getting 2 to 3 million. Let's snap our fingers, go back to where we were 50 years ago when CEOs still well paid. They got 20 to 30 times what an ordinary worker would get. So maybe they get 2.5, 3 million. Well, if the CEO is getting 3 million bucks, odds are the third layer of management is not also getting 3 million bucks. Maybe you're getting a million, maybe you're getting 800,000, plenty of money for most people, but, considerably less. And it spills over to other sectors. It's not uncommon to see someone working for a big foundation, a charity, or university president. They might get 2 or 3 million. This affects pay structures throughout the economy. So I took real issue with this. It's not a free market. And it of course gives it much more legitimacy if you say, well, they're worth 30 million. And you go, no, 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 they're actually not worth 30 million. They rigged the game. They picked the people. I always say, if I had my friends determining my pay and they were sitting in, a corporation that has hundreds of billions of dollars, I'd hope they pay me well too, but that's not a free market. That's a joke.
Yeah, no,
So
I think that's a really important point, but I also think the severing from shareholder value is an important point, uh, more broadly, because not only does it address and challenge a foundational myth of the center left, but of leftists like myself. And that's why a light bulb went off for me, because I've sort of tended to have that. I've been well aware of the increase in the disparity between CEO pay and average worker pay and so on. But I've tended to think, well, that's because CEOs, so much of their compensation is in the form of stock options that they're managing to the stock price rather than to either stakeholder value or the long-term financial viability of their company. They're just looking to the quarterly returns, and that's ruining modern, capitalism and so on. But I have not I was not aware until I read your piece about the extent of which even that dubious measurement of value is not really. And I was certainly aware because in my last couple of corporate jobs, I dealt with the boards directly. And I was certainly aware that was a hell of a cushy job that paid great for very little work. And I was, of course, how can I get in on this? Was my first reaction. And they were normally politicians and from both parties, and occasionally you'd run into Henry Kissinger or somebody, mostly ex-governors of Nevada or what have you, or White House chiefs of staff, and but they were all making cushy money doing exactly what you said, not rocking the boat and upholding the status quo. So, and of course, they were usually handpicked by the CEO to begin with. So, they knew how to get along coming in. But it didn't occur to me until I read your piece and saw some of the references you cited, how much even that kind of paltry measure of shareholder value is, they're not really incented very much to even look at that, are they?
no, they don't have to. And there's any number of examples. I mentioned the Boeing, I'm forgetting the guy's name, but he brought the company to the brink of ruin. They had their Max 720 777, if I'm getting the name right, the new airplane that was developed under his watch, and there were all these safety issues, and they had several crashes. They had two crashes, which thankfully is a rare event, with modern airlines. But there were two crashes that were due to problems with the system, with the way the plane was designed, its navigation system. And that could and should have been prevented. So they fired him and he walked away with over $60 million. Now, I had people tell me, well, he'd earned that. You go, wait a second, what do you mean he earned that? He didn't produce shareholder value. He cost them an enormous amount. And they were saying, well, they couldn't just not pay him. I go, these are supposed to be smart people. They know how to write a contract. So you could write a contract, and obviously the wording wouldn't be this, but you could write a contract saying, if you bring the company to the brink of ruin, you don't walk away with $60 million. I mean, I know how to write a contract like that. I'd have to sit down and think about it. And if you have a CEO that says, oh, I couldn't take a deal like that, you go, why not?
Right, of course. But of course they do. This is exactly how they do it. They anticipate every possible outcome for themselves. And so they do walk away. It's like rewarding the captain of the Exxon Valdez for sinking his boat, but they think about that going. It's like a prenup or something. But you also, and again, I don't want to pick on this particular journalist either, because first of all, I'm grateful that anybody anywhere is still a labor reporter in this day and age.
Yeah.
It's such a missing element of journalism. But you quote him, I won't name him, as saying that there were, according to him, there were benefits to the alleged shift to a focus on shareholder as opposed to stakeholder value. And then you quote the Times piece, quote, the economy became more efficient and dynamic. consumers often benefited, and American firms became the most innovative on the planet. I mean, now I read those sentences with an enormous degree of skepticism, but you go further, and you sort of try to look at the data and see do the data bear up the idea that this is in fact the case. And I think you're pretty clear they don't, right?
Yeah, so you have a lot of people that kind of throw these words around, again, not to pick on the guy, but they say, oh, dynamic, creative, whatever. And okay, those are all great things to say, and in some ways that's true, but the economy had always been dynamic and creative. So it creates this basically false stereotype of what the economy was before and compares it with this dynamic, creative economy. Well, the economy, by most measures, was very dynamic and creative in the stakeholder capitalism days. So the measure I took, which I think is the best measure of dynamism, productivity growth. How much does the value of output increase per hour of work? And if we go back to the bad old days, and I go 47 to 73, it was about 3% a year. And then we take the good days since stakeholder value came in 1980. It's been about 1.5% a year. And where I come from, 1.5% is a lot less than 3%. And again, this is real world stuff in a sense. When you had 3% a year productivity growth, wages were growing almost as rapidly, about 2.5% a year. People were getting measurably better off in their lifetime. And the idea that this was a stagnant economy, no dynamism, no one had TVs in 47. Everyone had TVs in 73. No one had, I mean, a whole list of things you could think of. Cars were still a luxury. Cars were very much the norm. I mean, you can go through a whole list of things that air conditioning. Air
Right.
conditioning was very common in 73. No one had it in 47. I mean,
Right.
things that really made a big difference in people's lives. I should honor our current Health and Human Services Secretary. People didn't have the polio vaccine in 47. Everyone had it in 73. Measles, these made a big, big difference in people's lives, and they didn't give them autism. Sorry. To pretend that that was a period of stagnation, that is just turning reality on its head. Then we get to the period 80, 80 to the present. There were gains. I'm not going to say, the economy didn't have gains. They weren't evenly shared. Obviously, our CEO friends made out like bandits. The typical worker, they're better off. I'm not going to say there's been no improvements. I mean, definitely, the typical worker's better off in 225 than they were in 1980, but nothing like the gains that we saw between 47 and 73. So it's just this invented reality, which unfortunately I think a lot of people buy into. And it's a real problem because if you think that there were these big dividends to, shareholder capitalism or whatever we want to call it, then that's an argument for it, obviously. But if you go, no, there actually weren't clear dividends. I mean, there were clear dividends, obviously, for the CEOs and people at the top of the income ladder. But most people, there were not clear dividends. They were doing much better in the earlier period. And that's something I think it's really important to be clear about, particularly if you're looking to have progressive change. We have to be clear what the landscape looks like.
So just to summarize up to now, Dean Baker, you're saying, in effect, number one, it's not shareholder capitalism, despite the assertion. And number two, shareholder capitalism itself is not the panacea it's being made out to be. And assuming that I'm right in those two, so summaries, then you go to, for example, the absence of a counterforce. And you mentioned your book, Rigged, which is, as you mentioned, free. We like free, but you point out that there is. Before we get to the media, you point out that the counterforce for the way this economy has gone with under the systems of cronyism, I would call it, that we just described. You mentioned that, to your mind, the story is a lack of an institutional structure that supports a challenge, for example, to Trump, and exploring the question of why there's been a mass capitulation on part of industry leaders, and that the most important story here is the reduced power of organized labor. And I would strongly agree with that, but let's talk about that for a second. Why do you say that?
Yeah, let me come back to this a second. I just want to say one more thing in passing. I think it may not have been clear. It's not just a pedantic point with me saying that it's not stakeholder capitalism, it's basically cronyism. Because stakeholder capitalism, whether you like it or not, there's a coherence to that. There's a free market,
You
that's a
mean
we could
stakeholder
bring
or
Milton.
shareholder, just to be clear?
Shareholder, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
shareholder, yeah.
Mhm.
So we could bring Milton Friedman in and, wake him from the dead and he'll give
Sure.
the argument. He's a very articulate guy. And, there's an argument there. There is no argument for crony capitalism, except I'm a crony capitalist. I'm going to get richer. That's the
Right.
argument for.
Right.
So that's why I think that's an important point. Now, getting to the labor movement, labor was a serious force in society. If we go back to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, into the 70s, 30% of the labor force was unionized. Workers, if the United Auto Workers went on strike, the steel work, that was a force to be reckoned with. You had to deal with them. You had to talk to them. I mean, I suppose you could look to send in the cops and beat their heads, but that was not a good thing to do for the most part because other workers would be on strike. So that wasn't done. Today, 10% of the workforce is unionized, 6% in the private sector. They're not the same force. It's not zero, and I appreciate that. So where you have progressive politics, you have someone like Newsom in California, relatively progressive state still, it's almost certainly because there is still strong labor movement there. But nationwide, they don't have anywhere near the power that they did 40 or 50 years ago. And that means there's much less ability to push back against someone like Donald Trump. And that's, why, the article Schreiber was writing about was the basis of why are these firms capitulating? Why does the CEO of Apple have to genuflect before Trump? Why do the universities, why are they capitulating? Why, you see it here and everywhere. And basically there's not a well-organized resistance to it. Labor in years past would have been, but they just don't have the power that they did 50 years ago.
And I guess my, counter to that would also be in the absence of a resisting force, a contrary force. Uh, it's not that they have to. I mean, they could be profiles in courage or even profiles in moderate courage and retire to their ranches with $100 million, having stood up for the right thing and live a nice life. But they prefer to capitulate because to me, it's an extension of the same crony capitalism that says, hey, if I can make, another $500 million by sucking up to Trump, I don't care. Sure, I'll do that. So to me, even the term capitulation is somehow uh, spinning tilting the conversation in a slightly different direction from the way I see reality. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not clear they even see it. You or I would see it as capitulation because we like to think we have some principles. But
Right.
Mark Zuckerberg's got 200 billion and he wants to have 300 billion. So his bottom line is how do I get from 200 to 300? I was joking about it, how, it's easy for you and me to criticize Trump because we don't have $200 billion we have to look after. It's, and that seems to be his attitude. And I don't mind picking at Mark Zuckerberg, but the problem is there's a lot of Mark Zuckerbergs out there. So
Right.
they're concerned, oh, how can I get more money? And yeah, as far as I know, I don't know any of these people personally, but as far as I know, they don't see the sacrificing anything. They're just, okay, this is what I have to do to, make my fortune even bigger. Sure, I'll go ahead and do it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the tech guys had a period of being cool and disruptive and wearing hoodies and all that. Uh, but all of a sudden now, Jeff Bezos is saying we won't have any commentary on the editorial page of the Washington Post that doesn't support free markets and personal liberty. He sounds like a Chamber of Commerce speaker from 1958 in Peoria, and that's all the same to them. I mean, I think that's part of what we're dealing with here. So you pivot to institutional challenges to this, and then from the unions you go to a subject also dear to my heart, which is media. And you mentioned that in addition to the broad economic issues you discuss, the left and center and could have pushed for alternative support mechanisms for the media, such as individual vouchers or tax credits. What a great idea. I'd love people to ask people to cash in their vouchers on the 0 hour, but tell us a little bit about that. Why do we need alternative media channels, and why do we need policies to foster them? I mean, I'm not asking you to give a whole exposition, but
Yeah, no, no. Well, the logic, we're rapidly seeing the media. I mean, it's always been, I don't want to glorify the age of Walter Cronkite or whatever, but you did have people that at least had some commitment to truth. I like
right.
not to say they always got it right, but I think they tried to, I'll put it that way. There was plenty of ideology. We're both old enough to remember the Vietnam War. A lot of grounds for complaints, but there was some commitment to try and tell the truth. We have people now, Murdoch at Fox is probably the best example, but it goes well beyond that. And they're moving in. CBS is being taken over by Larry Ellison, who's also one of the richest people in the world now, CEO or former CEO of Oracle, software company. He's very much a right winger, committed to make it a right wing outlet. He also has a stake in Time Warner, which owns CNN. I mean, it goes down the list. I don't have to go through all of this. So I was arguing we should have tried, and it's not too late to still try to build up alternatives. And people look at PBS and they go, "Well, they just took away all the money." That's unfortunate. I wish they didn't, but they did, and that was not a reliable alternative because at the end of the day, that is still under control of the government. I mean, I've asked people, go, okay, I'm unhappy about them taking away the money for PBS, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but did you want Donald Trump running it? And we go, no, 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 no. Well, I'm sorry, that's what we would have had. So we need an independent source of media. And this is what I'm suggesting with this individual voucher, that we have some amount of money, say $100, $150, we could argue over what it might be, that goes to support the news outlets of your choice. And again, that could be, some will be right wing, no doubt about it. The Trumpers
Sure.
will get their money too. But
Yeah.
to my view, it doesn't matter. They already have Fox. Well, these other, if they want to have more, that's fine. That's their business. They could do that. But the point is, there would be a lot of money to support the 0 hour, to support, all sorts of progressive publications, and new ones would come up because people would see there's a pot of money out there, so
Right.
they could, people who might be working a dead end job, or maybe they have, that they're okay with their, they're in their 50s or 60s, they have enough money put aside so they could take some risk. You would see a lot more reporting, a lot more serious reporting, and you would get these viewpoints out. And that could be a counterbalance. Would it be enough? Well, who knows? But we'd be a lot better off if we had, tens of thousands of people who were working, covering the news in outlets like that, put it over the web, millions of people, tens of millions of people could see it. And I think would make a very big difference. And one of the points that I really love about this is it can be done. People go, "Well, you need Congress to." No, I understand that. But it could be done at the state level. It could be done at the local level.
Yeah.
And I mentioned Kate Wilson, who's running for mayor. She actually won the primary there. She got the most votes. Everyone votes together in the primary, and she got the most votes. She has a tough race. So I don't know how that'll come out this fall. But in any case, she's a big supporter of this. So you could have it done at the city level, the city of Seattle. I mean, again, she's a supporter. I don't know if she'll get it in if she's mayor, but she will certainly try. It could be done in New York City. It could be done, anywhere where you have a reasonable progressive movement. This is something that could be done. And again, you could tell the right wingers there, they go, "Oh, you all want your money for," it'll go to your friends too. It's not,
Right.
it's
And
not,
and the answer to the right wingers is also, I mean, it's essentially a market driven approach. I see a consistency in opposing publicly funded charter schools and supporting this idea, but I also see an inconsistency in supporting publicly funded charter schools and opposing this idea because if you support school vouchers, how can you object to this? In effect, I mean, maybe that's simplistic.
I make the analogy to the charitable contribution tax deduction. So
Mm-hmm.
if you have a rich person that gives $1 million to whatever organization they support, it could be a church, it could be a nonprofit of different sorts. It could be a good thing, bad thing, doesn't matter. The government gives them 40% of that back because they're in a 40% bracket. So they get 40. They gave $1 million. Well, 400,000 that's out of our taxpayers' pockets. So what I'm saying here is okay. This case, it'll be 100%, but instead of, it won't be 400,000, we have $100, we have 150, whatever it is, it'll be much less money per person, but it's a similar story. Just as the rich person gets to decide who gets his $1 million, you or I get to decide who gets our 100 or 150, whatever it might be.
I think it's a great idea and really interesting one. I'd love to see more done about it. And the interesting parallel to me, Dean, is that in a way, being part of the media myself, I see a sort of linkage between this and the board of directors moral hazard problem, in the sense that, for example, and I've talked to a lot of journalists about this. I've done journalism about journalism where I've talked to a lot of journalists, but I've also just privately, I'm one of I'm not old school. I did a lot of other things before coming back to journalism, but I'm old school in the sense that if I write something and I mean to say the bank panic of 1893 and I write the bank panic of 1883 and it goes to press, I'm like clinically depressed for a week. I just do not, even if it's immaterial and nobody catches it, I do not like getting anything wrong. But a lot of people, even in the non-ideological mainstream media, they don't care. It's not their incentive. Their incentive is they're among the few journalists who have a good gig. And if they get something wrong, they get something wrong. To me, that's similar to the mindset of the board member. I'd be depressed if I fought to hire a guy who drove my company into bankruptcy as a board member. I'd be racked with self-recrimination. But that, he gets his 60 million, no problem. To me, it's a similar example of perverse incentives at work, and the goal to, as long as we're working in the economic reality of incentives and so on, to align them with the public interest a little better than they're aligned right now, whether it's the media, whether it's corporations or anything else. Make sense?
I think so. And, to my view, what's good about this, and again, people may like garbage, but, I'm inclined to think if people are putting out good work, they'll get support for it. And this means people have the money to support it. So you could say that, oh, yeah, if people are putting out good work, why won't they do it today? Well, a lot of people that might want to support them, they don't have a lot of money to throw out. But this is giving, everyone's got the 100, 150, whatever it might be. That, if you're putting out good work, you should be able to get someone to support you.
And the other parallel here is that we've had seen a drop in public favorability ratings towards corporations and the media, and in both cases, there's some merit to it. And I've tried to argue that if you get something, however trivial, wrong about what this political figure or that political figure said, that undermining of your credibility may hurt you when you're reporting on something of enormous public interest, like the COVID vaccine or what have you. So, and with corporations, same thing, that if you lose public trust, I think now 60, some 2/3 of the electorate says they have an unfavorable opinion of large corporations. Well, it's justified, in my opinion, probably too low, but, arguably that's not in the interests of whatever capitalism you represent, except that the people who ruin those companies and drive them into the ground will get nice golden parachutes. But you get where I'm going with all of that?
Yeah, yeah. And my hope would be if we ever got a system like this is that people really would identify with the news, the reporters, the news outlets they choose to support. And, there'd be a responsibility, so I have, and, you and I both feel this, we know we have some viewers out there, people support our work, and you feel responsible, not because we're worried they'll cut us off, but just because, no, they voted, it's a vote of confidence in us. And, in this case, if you had something like this voucher system, people are putting their money, they're saying they think your product's worthwhile, what you're doing is worthwhile. You feel an obligation to them, so I think that's what you want. That would be a great system.
Yes, I like it a lot. And Dean, we didn't even get a chance to talk about your other piece I wanted to talk about, which is about climate change and affordability, and the fact that the media is dropping the ball on explaining how much climate change would address families' bottom lines. And even though I've been on the Chinese electric car beat for a long time, I didn't realize they had a new one that sells for less than $10,000. I mean, ideology and policy opinions aside, I'd really like to be able to buy an electric car for $8,000. That would make me really happy as a consumer.
It's astounding how much progress has been made in developing, electric cars, batteries. They could recharge their batteries now, could be recharged in 5 minutes.
Wow.
They're just, making enormous progress in wind and solar. It's now like, I think it's 26%, the latest data I saw, 26% of their electricity. I mean, it's unfortunate it's China. People are going, oh, you're singing the praises of China. Well, that's the reality. I mean, I wish it were us. Biden started to do that, and I give him enormous credit for it. But Trump's taken a sledgehammer to it. He wants to destroy everything Biden did. And whether that's just pure maliciousness, whether it's his campaign contributors or fossil fuel companies, whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is the same. He's trying to destroy whatever progress we made. And if we're looking to who's going to save the world from global warming, and so far as we could still do that, it's China. That's just the reality.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.